My name is Thomas Wilkins, and I hold an endowed chair, a Germisch chair for youth education, youth concerts and education with the Boston Symphony, music director of the Omaha Symphony, and the principal conductor of the Hollywood Bowl Orchestra, and I also hold a chair on the music faculty at Jacobs School of Music at Indiana University. I'm the weird guy who's wanted to be a conductor since I was 8 years old. I didn't know why. I didn't have a sophisticated answer to why at that time. I knew my third grade class got on a bus and went to go hear what was called the Norfolk Symphony Orchestra. It's now the Virginia Symphony. And I had never heard an orchestra before. And I remember seeing all those people on the stage. And this man comes out, his name was Russell Stenger, and he starts to wave his arms, and this other man with long blonde hair played a roll on the snare drum, and then the orchestra played the national anthem, and I was hooked at that moment. And I was hooked by the sound of this thing called the orchestra. And when I relay the story later, I talk about how, you know, McDonald's restaurants have those playlands sometimes, and there are these big giant compartments that's netted around with all these plastic balls with different colors, and kids can just jump in and they can throw the balls in the air, they can curl underneath. For me, that was the sensation of sound. It was just, I was just immersed in all of these colors and all of these sonorities, and I just knew that I wanted to do that. In fact, it wasn't even that I wanted to play so much as that I wanted to be the person like that guy, that conductor, Russell Stenger, who was so intimately and related, connected to all of those sounds. So that was it. I mean, and I'm literally living my life's dream, which is a huge blessing. There's always a lot of mile marker turning points that if we keep our hearts and our heads open, we realize what they are. You know, I can remember the first time that I saw a colleague of mine conducting. In fact, it was Marion Ossip, a good friend of mine, and we were both working for the Richmond Symphony at the same time. She was on her way out, I was on my way in, and I saw her rehearse something with that orchestra. I had just come from teaching at University of Tennessee in Chattanooga, and I saw her rehearse in a way that just blew my mind, because she was talking about bow speed and vibrato and where on the bow they should be and all kinds of musical things. And it suddenly dawned on me that I had spent a majority of my time studying scores but not making a decision about how I wanted the piece to go. I could tell you how many phrases were in a section or how many bars were in a phrase and what the harmonic analysis was, but whether or not I wanted it on the string or off the string or legato tongued or staccato tongued, I hadn't made any of those decisions. Which is ironic, because another one of those turning points happened for me in graduate school when I took a course called Interpretation of Chamber Music. Ben Zander was a teacher at New England Conservatory, and we had to do all kinds of, we had to read poetry in class, and we had to do dramatic readings in class. And his point was that the best part about studying a score is the last part, deciding is it Caribbean or Caribbean, for crying out loud, you know. So it's funny that I had that course that was so influenced by it, but then I got out and now all I'm doing is studying, you know, and had abandoned that really great part of music making. So that was one turning point. Another that I remember specifically was being one of 10 young American conductors chosen to do a master class. The first guy gets up to conduct, and he says nothing. And the whole room, I mean, there's other conductors there auditing this thing too, so no one's getting anything. So the guy's good. So the second guy gets up to conduct, and he says nothing. And I'm thinking to myself, man, this guy's, you know, such a genius. I guess if he doesn't think you have any talent, he's just not going to waste any words on you or something, you know, how your mind starts playing tricks on you, you know. So I said, well, I'm just going to get up and rehearse. And so, I got up and I started rehearsing. It was Academic Festival Overture. And I started rehearsing this bass passage, and he stopped and said, this is his first words of the day. He says, you know, I wanted to tune that section for years and have never had the nerve. And everybody started to crack, because that's what I was doing, was tuning the spot of the basses. And then we all got a private lesson with him after it was over. And he recalled every single thing I did in the 25 minutes I was conducting that orchestra. Everything I did, everything I said, everything I should have said, and everything I should not have said. And I remember walking back to my hotel thinking, I guess the right response is, regardless of how good you are, thankfully there's always someone better than you are. And there's always a place for you to go to get better. And you know, that was a remarkable time for me. I think what I find myself doing with a lot of young conductors is getting rid of what I call young conductoritis. And I know it exists because I had it. And it manifests itself in a couple ways. Young conductors overconduct, and young conductors talk too much. And they overconduct because they haven't learned the value of trust, and they haven't learned the responsibility of empowering players. Because per our earlier conversation, if it's our job to help them become better human beings at the end of the day, that includes being better artists. And when we dictate every single musical gesture to them and don't give them any real estate to create on their own, they're only stifled. They don't grow from that. And they don't have a sense that you really believe in them. And that carries over, that extends far beyond just their ability to play a musical phrase. Empowering someone by showing them that you trust them, that does something to them as human beings, as well as them as musicians. In fact, I heard, when I first got to Omaha, they weren't used to that. And I remember assistant principal second came up to me one after rehearsal. He goes, "Golly," he says, "when you stop conducting, I feel my ears just expand." Because they have to all of a sudden now start to listen to each other. This just happened to me in Germany a few weeks ago. They're a state orchestra, and they're you know, in the pit all the time, and they, you know, when they become an orchestra, the same thing. All the gestures get dictated to them. And I said to them, I said, "I'm just going to nag you all week until you start listening to each other. I'm not going to give you everything, because sometimes what you give me is better than what I would suggest that you give me." And they were so elated, so profoundly elated. They were smiling and they were happy, and they made beautiful music, and they knew what had happened. And many of them, in their broken English, came up to thank me for, you know, equipping them to be better artists. You know, so that's one thing, is that that's the downside of one downside of overconducting. Another downside of overconducting is that you just end up physically beat up. You know, and also your musical gestures mean less because you're giving too much. So that's one thing that I find that's typical. The other thing is that young conductors, well, I shouldn't blame it on young conductors. Some conductors also talk too much. And the reason that we do that is because we feel this overwhelming need to prove to the orchestra that we studied the score and therefore deserve to be on the podium. The reality is that none of us deserve to be on the podium. We get to participate in something that's far bigger than we are, and we will never earn that right. We just have to understand that it's a gift to us to be able to partake in something that's so much greater and will outlast us all. And so there's no need to prove to anybody anything except that we understand this music is greater than we are, and we're going to try to get it to speak so that someone in the audience life is transformed when the night is over. Oh my gosh, it has changed. Um, it's nice to be at a stage in your life where you feel like A, you know what you're talking about, and B, you're not trying to impress anybody. So you can get right to it. And I am a person who's comfortable in my own skin. Um, and I'm not worried about where the authority lines are drawn in a relationship with an orchestra, because to my earlier point, the music is the entity with the most authority in the room. So I just get at it, and I am a lot about the fun of making music, the joy of making music, and I am much more passionate than I was when I was younger. I'm much more emotionally connected to every single note than I was early in my life. Because maybe I was too worried about getting it right. You know how they say some football teams play to win and others play not to lose. I always play to win, and not that I would win, but that the music would win, and that the person sitting in the audience would win. And so I don't hold back anymore. And I know that's a development of the last probably 20 years for me. And it is for sure that my happiest place of existence as a human being is when I'm on the podium. It's my happiest place, is my most comfortable place. Even when it's hard work, it's still, something that I really want to be a part of. My all-time favorite artist, period, is James Taylor. I know. James Taylor inspires me to conduct Mozart better, and Beethoven better, and Brahms better. I've tried to explain it before, but I love the quality of his voice. I love the way he plays guitar. I love his poetry. I love the way he uses his voice to tell his story. And there's not a James Taylor song that I can't sing back to you all of the words. He's just my favorite artist. And I've never met him. And even with me working at the Boston Symphony, an orchestra he's very closely related to, we just haven't bumped into each other yet. But when we do, I'm going to tell him that, because he's probably already had heard it from our staff in Boston. But then there were other people like James DePriest. I was at a restaurant in Portland with James because he was teaching a course that I must have been taking. And so we walk into the restaurant and people just started to applaud. Period. This wasn't after a concert or anything. This was just going to a restaurant in town. And he was so beloved in that city that was their response when he walked into the restaurant. That was really neat. And that told me something about him and his connection to the people of that city. Not about his music making, about him as a person. So he was a strong influence. And then finally we got to actually share a concert with the Philadelphia Orchestra, which was really cool. Quite a number of years now, so I got to spend some different musical time with him. And I think he was a person who also, he saw something in me that he wanted to encourage, and so he was very good about that. There's a difference, I should point out though, between preparing a score and learning a score. There are many occasions, especially when you're young and you're an assistant, and you got a bunch of different programs and a bunch of different repertoire, even if it's just movements of things, but you have no time. Often what you're doing is preparing the score, making it so that you can actually conduct it and have it make some musical sense and have you be as clear as possible. If you get one rehearsal for something, you're not going to walk away with your definitive performance of Beethoven's 8th Symphony. It's just not going to happen in that one rehearsal. The older you get, the easier it is to pull off something like that in one rehearsal, where it's really truly a different performance because your whole means of communicating is different. But most often, what you're doing is preparing. So that's the dotting of the I's and crossing the T's. I want to know where the phrases are, where the big points are, where the harmonic clashes are, where the important cues are. I mean, even something like, someone has been out, they've been counting measures, rest for 40 measures. It seems like nothing, but just to be able to nod to them and go, yes, you have counted correctly, is an important thing to be able to give to a player. So that's preparing a score. For me, studying a score, it is basically this. You are entering a relationship with a piece of music, entering into a relationship with a piece of music. And just like any other kinds of relationships, you don't go after the details, be they sketchy or beautiful details, in the beginning of the relationship, because you're not there yet. Like in a friendship, you don't walk up to a person that you just met and say, "Tell me about your marital problems," or whatever, or whatever. So whatever it is, that stuff comes later. Those deep relationship things come later in a human relationship. So in a score, I do the big picture, general stuff first. I basically read it first. I literally read it like a book. The title, who the publisher is, what the year of copyright, everything, and I'm just looking at it, glancing at the pages, and I might see a word that I don't know what it means, so I make note. Oh, there, I know I'm going to have to look at that word later when I'm digging deeper in. Sometimes I do a harmonic analysis of every bar. I find that I have less time to do that now, and also I hear differently than I heard when I was younger, so I don't have to do it so much anymore. What I like about that, though, is that it makes you get a glimpse of every note on the page sooner rather than later. See, so now I've sort of abandoned my macro to micro process, and after I've generally read it, then I'm looking for a little more detail, a little greater detail. I do a phrase analysis of the piece. I do I'll make sure that there is not a word in the piece, a term that I don't know the definition of, and I make sure that I write it down in the score. I got busted by Marisa Bravanel on that one really nicely one time. And then comes that part about the decision making in the music. And sometimes that decision making is, it's on a lot of different levels. It's difficulty. The other thing, by the way, that you see when you're just reading the score as a book is the density of the page. So you take note of the fact that, oh my gosh, there's pages where there's nothing but string writing going on here, or whoa, holy smokes, I'm gonna have to look at that to figure out how that's gonna get balanced. And if it's an interesting chord, you want to make sure that the right notes in the chord are heard so that we actually get it, what the composer is trying to say by adding a certain note to a chord or whatever. But if it's tucked away in the second oboe, then you have to make some room for it, that kind of stuff. Those decisions have to be made. And then the decisions of what do I think this piece says. And there are indeed, that you, in your looking at the score at various different angles, there are indeed clues that a composer will put in there that will help you make some interpretive decisions. You think about forte markings in Brahms, and the fact that Beethoven rarely uses mezzo piano, so you have to make a decision about the difference between piano and pianissimo, or what Mozart intends for the bow stroke when he writes mezzo forte, that kind of thing. Some of those clues are in there. But then after that, you've got to make some decisions as to, is this, I say to people, if I were to say to you, he lost his life, not only his home, that's one meaning. But if I were to use the exact same words and say he lost his life, not only his home, then that's the exact same words, but the meaning is profoundly different. So you have to make those decisions. And then the cool part is that my teacher used to always say to me, you know, when you guest conduct an orchestra for the first time, be sure to go all the way from the beginning to the end without stopping, just in case some of their ideas are better than yours. You know, and then you know, this whole point about me being comfortable in my own skin, and I'm at a stage where I'm not trying to impress anybody anymore. If I hear something from someone that I think is better than what I was going to ask them to do, I will tell them that, first of all, because I want them to be encouraged and uplifted, but also because it just is, you know. Sometimes that happens. Or sometimes you make a decision at your desk that in real time, sometimes it's actually a conductorial decision too, you make at your desk, because it's always together when it's just you singing, right? So sometimes you have to be willing to make an adjustment on the fly, because something that you thought, either a musical decision doesn't translate as well as you thought it was going to translate, or a gesture doesn't communicate as well as you thought it was going to communicate. So and then the last stage for me is, I guess you could call it a stage. I'll just spend time just staring at the page again, just looking at it again. Looking, I'm not thinking about anything, I'm just looking. I'll see something that will pop into my head, but you know how sometimes when you were young and you were in high school and you took a math test or whatever test, and you could remember where on the page in your notes the answer was because you spent so much time staring? It's that same sort of sensation that when you look down, oh yeah, of course I know what that is because I've looked at it so much. That frees you to have this kind of presentation to the ensemble. Because if all they see is this all the time, then you're not going to get nearly the musical result that you think you're going to get. So that last stage of just double checking the dotted I's and the crossed T's is important. You know, sometimes you conduct, you end up turning 3 or 4 pages because you spent time doing what you're supposed to be doing, and that's listening. You know, the minute that you're thinking about anything else when you're on the podium, you're no longer listening. So if you're thinking about how am I going to execute this physically, or if you're thinking about, I'm not sure if I remember how this goes, again, you're not listening. So. But I remember one night, now, I grew up listening to Rhapsody in Blue. I love Rhapsody in Blue as a kid, you know. And so I heard it a million times. And I'm conducting it, my first professional job. And the pianist, and the score, if you've seen the original score, not the original, but the old set of printed parts, all the piano cadenzas are these tiny, skinny little lines, you know. Now, I could have conducted that piece from memory, because I've heard it so much that I know every moment of that piece. So the piano cadenza is going, one of them, and it's the time to bring in the horn solo, beep, boom, beep, right? And I think I'm being diligent, and I'm staring at the piano part instead of using these, and I skip a line. And the music looks the same, but it's just not the same place in the phrase. And my hand goes up to bring in the horn player, and he's like looking at me going like this. And gravity takes over, and my hand comes down, and he comes in, and then I stop. I was mortified. Nothing happened. We just kept going. So I said that to my then orchestra person, Pam, you know, my go-to person. I said, Pam, God, it just felt so hard. The next night, I said, it just felt terrible about what happened last night. She goes, we do this every day. What do you think? You're not going to make a mistake? Move on, you know? And so, because I was so young, that was horrifying to me that I would, you know, now I don't think I would think twice about it. Well, now I certainly wouldn't be following the stupid part, but, you know. You have to understand that less is more. That would be one big tip. And the other tip is what they see is what you get. If you don't give them something that is sure and confident and decisive, then I mean, in your presentation and in your gestures, these gestures are to be done with intent. You can't just sort of throw something out there and hope you get something back. You have to give them a gesture that tells them how you want that to go. And if you're not decisive and sure about that, the musical result that you're going to get back is something that is indecisive and unsure as well.